On the evening of Sunday, the 9th of June, 1912, 8 people were alive inside a modest 2-story house on East 2nd Street in Villisca, Iowa. By dawn, all 8 were dead. The killings occurred within a window of approximately 90 minutes, sometime between midnight and 2 o'clock in the morning. No one in the neighboring houses heard a sound. Villisca was a small farming community in Montgomery County, southwestern Iowa, roughly 70 miles from Des Moines. The population in 1912 stood at around 2,500 residents. It was a place built on wheat, corn, and livestock. Most people knew one another. The town had churches, a railway station, a few shops, and quiet residential streets lined with wooden houses. Crime was infrequent. Violent crime was almost unheard of. The house itself was unremarkable. It belonged to Josiah B. Moore, known locally as J.B. Moore. He was 43 years old and worked as a manager for the John Deere Implement Company in Villisca. His wife, Sarah Montgomery Moore, was 39. They had 4 children: Herman, aged 11, Katherine, 10, Boyd, 7, and Paul, 5. The family attended the Presbyterian church regularly. They were considered respectable, well-liked, and ordinary in every visible way. That Sunday, the 9th of June, was Children's Day at the Presbyterian church. It was an annual event. There was a service in the evening, followed by a program of songs and recitals performed by the children of the congregation. The Moore family attended. So did 2 visiting children, Lena Gertrude Stillinger, aged 12, and her younger sister, Ina May Stillinger, aged 8. The Stillinger girls lived nearby with their parents. After the program, Sarah Moore invited the sisters to spend the night at the Moore house. The girls accepted. Their parents gave permission. The evening program ended shortly before 9:30. The Moore family walked home with Lena and Ina. The distance from the church to the house was less than half a mile. They arrived home a few minutes before 10 o'clock. Several neighbors reported seeing the family enter the house. The front door was closed. The lights were turned on briefly, then extinguished. No one reported seeing anyone leave. The house had 7 rooms. Downstairs there was a parlor, a sitting room, a dining room, and a kitchen. Upstairs there were 2 bedrooms. The larger bedroom at the front of the house was where Josiah and Sarah Moore slept. The smaller bedroom at the rear was shared by the 4 Moore children. There was also a small guest room downstairs, adjacent to the parlor, where the Stillinger sisters were to sleep that night. It is believed that the family followed their usual routine. The children likely changed into nightclothes. Josiah Moore may have locked the doors, though this detail remains uncertain. The house settled into silence. Outside Villisca was quiet. There were no street disturbances, no storms, no extraordinary events. The night was warm and still. Sometime after the lights went out, someone entered the house. How this person gained entry has never been conclusively determined. The back door, which led into the kitchen, was later found to be unlocked. Whether it had been left unlocked by the family, or whether the intruder unlocked it from the inside after entering through another means, remains unclear. No windows were broken, no doors were forced. The entry was silent. The intruder moved through the house without waking anyone. It is believed that the killer first went upstairs, to the room where the 4 Moore children slept. Then, the killer crossed the narrow hallway to the room where Josiah and Sarah Moore were sleeping. Finally, the killer went back downstairs to the guest room where Lena and Ina Stillinger were sleeping. All of this occurred in darkness. All of it occurred in silence. By the time the sun rose on Monday, the 10th of June, 1912, every person inside the house was dead. The murder weapon was found in the guest room. It was an axe. It had belonged to Josiah Moore. It had been stored in the coal shed behind the house. The killer had brought it inside. No neighbors reported hearing screams. No one reported hearing footsteps. No one reported seeing anyone enter or leave the house during the night. The silence was total. At approximately 7 o'clock the following morning, a neighbor named Mary Peckham noticed that the house remained closed and quiet. The Moore family were known to rise early. The children were usually outside by this hour. The curtains were still drawn. Mary Peckham knocked on the door. There was no answer. She tried the door. It was locked from the inside. She knocked again, still no response. Concerned, Mary Peckham contacted Josiah Moore's brother, Ross Moore, who lived nearby. Ross Moore arrived shortly after 8 o'clock. He also knocked. He called out. He received no reply. He tried the door and found it locked. He walked around to the rear of the house and tried the back door. It opened. Ross Moore stepped inside. He called out again. The house was silent. He moved through the downstairs rooms. In the guest room, he saw the bodies of the 2 Stillinger girls. He did not go upstairs. He left the house immediately and telephoned the town marshal. The town marshal's name was Hank Horton. He arrived within minutes, accompanied by several other townspeople. They entered the house together. What they found upstairs confirmed the worst. The entire Moore family had been killed in their beds. All 8 victims had suffered severe blunt force trauma to the head. The instrument used was an axe. The scene was methodical, it was brutal, and it was inexplicable. By mid-morning, word had spread throughout Villisca. Crowds began to gather outside the house. Law enforcement from neighboring towns arrived. Journalists were notified. Investigators from the Iowa Bureau of Criminal Investigation were summoned. By noon, the small wooden house on East 2nd Street had become the center of one of the most disturbing and puzzling murder cases in early 20th century America. No one had heard anything. No one had seen anything. And no one, it would turn out, would ever be successfully convicted of the crime. The bodies were discovered in 3 locations within the house. Upstairs, in the larger bedroom at the front, Josiah and Sarah Moore were found in their bed. Josiah was lying on his right side, facing the wall. Sarah was beside him, also on her side. Both had suffered multiple blows to the head. The weapon had been swung with considerable force. The skull of each victim had been fractured in several places. In the smaller bedroom at the rear of the upstairs, all 4 Moore children were found in a single bed. Herman, Katherine, Boyd, and Paul had been arranged side by side. Each child had been struck in the head. The injuries were concentrated on the upper left portion of the skull in most cases. The blows had been delivered while the children were lying down. There was no evidence that any of them had risen from the bed or attempted to flee. Downstairs, in the guest room adjacent to the parlor, Lena and Ina Stillinger were found in their bed. Both girls were lying face down. Like the others, they had been struck repeatedly in the head with a blunt instrument. The axe used in the killings was found in the guest room, resting on the floor near the bed. It was a standard-issue axe with a wooden handle, approximately 80 centimeters in length. The head of the axe was stained with blood. The handle bore no clear fingerprints. The axe had been taken from the Moore's coal shed, which was located behind the house. The shed was not locked. The killer had apparently retrieved the axe before entering the house, or shortly after entry, and returned it to the guest room after the murders were complete. Why the axe was left in that particular room has never been explained. All 8 victims were believed to have been killed between the hours of midnight and 2 o'clock in the morning. The exact sequence of the murders cannot be determined with certainty, but investigators concluded that the killer moved from room to room in a deliberate manner. It is generally believed that the children upstairs were killed first, followed by Josiah and Sarah Moore, and finally, the Stillinger sisters. This sequence is based on the positions of the bodies and the location of the weapon, though no definitive proof exists. None of the victims showed signs of having struggled. There were no defensive wounds on their hands or arms. The bedclothes were disturbed only slightly. This suggests that each victim was struck while asleep, or immediately upon waking, before any meaningful resistance could be made. The killer worked quickly and in near silence. The walls of the house were thin. Neighboring homes stood less than 30 meters away on either side. Yet no one reported hearing anything unusual during the night. The injuries inflicted were severe but methodical. Each victim had been struck multiple times, far more than would have been necessary to cause death. Josiah Moore, for instance, had suffered more than 30 separate blows to the head. Sarah Moore had been struck nearly as many times. The children had each been struck between 5 and 15 times. The Stillinger girls had also been struck repeatedly. The violence was excessive, but it was not chaotic. The killer had taken time with each victim. After the killings, the murderer engaged in a series of unusual actions. In each of the 3 rooms where bodies were found, mirrors had been covered. In the Moore parents' bedroom, a sheet had been draped over the dresser mirror. In the children's room, clothing had been placed over a small mirror on the wall. In the guest room, a towel covered the mirror above the washstand. Why the killer chose to do this remains unknown. Additionally, in the downstairs guest room, the killer had placed clothing over the faces of the Stillinger girls. A dress belonging to one of the Moore daughters was found draped over Lena Stillinger's body. A nightgown was placed over Ina's face. This was not done in the other rooms. The significance of this act, if any, has never been determined. A piece of bacon was found on the floor in the parlour. It had been taken from the icebox in the kitchen. The bacon had been partially wrapped in cloth. There were no bite marks. It was simply lying there. Some investigators speculated that the killer had taken food from the kitchen, though no other food items appeared to be missing. Others suggested the bacon may have been used to lure or quiet a dog, though the Moores did not own a dog. The presence of the bacon was never satisfactorily explained. In the kitchen, a basin had been filled with water, blood-stained water. It appeared that the killer had washed his hands and possibly his face before leaving. A kerosene lamp had been left burning in the kitchen, though it had been turned down to a very low flame. Another lamp was found burning in the parlour, also turned low. The lamps provided just enough light to navigate the house without being clearly visible from outside. The doors of the house were locked from the inside when the bodies were discovered. This suggests that the killer exited through a door, likely the back door leading from the kitchen, and then locked it from the outside using a key or by reaching through a gap in the door. Alternatively, the killer may have locked the door from the inside and exited through a window, though no windows were found open or disturbed. The precise method of exit has never been confirmed. Nothing of significant value was taken from the house. Josiah Moore's wallet, which contained a small amount of cash, was found undisturbed in his trousers, which were hanging in the bedroom. Sarah Moore's jewellery remained in place. The house had not been ransacked. Drawers had not been opened. There was no sign of theft or burglary. Robbery was ruled out as a motive almost immediately. The house was examined by local authorities, state investigators, and eventually by private detectives hired by parties connected to the case. The scene was not preserved in the manner that would be standard in later decades. Within hours of the discovery, dozens of townspeople had entered the house. Journalists photographed the rooms. Curiosity seekers walked through the upstairs bedrooms. Evidence was moved, touched, and contaminated. No fingerprints of value were recovered. No footprints were preserved. The integrity of the crime scene was compromised before professional analysis could begin. Medical examination of the bodies was conducted by local physicians. There was no forensic pathologist available in Villisca at the time. The doctors confirmed that all 8 victims had died from blunt force trauma to the head, specifically from repeated strikes with the axe. Time of death was estimated based on the condition of the bodies and the ambient temperature. No other injuries of note were found. There was no evidence of sexual assault. The killings appeared to have been committed solely for the purpose of killing. The brutality of the crime, combined with the absence of clear motive, created immediate public alarm. Villisca was not accustomed to violence of this nature. The fact that an entire family, along with 2 young guests, had been slaughtered in their sleep without anyone hearing or seeing anything was deeply unsettling. Theories began to circulate almost at once. Suspicion fell on multiple individuals, some with plausible connections to the case, others based purely on rumor and fear. But in the days immediately following the murders, no arrests were made, no weapon other than the axe was found. No clear suspect emerged. The investigation had begun, but it had begun poorly, and the silence that had allowed the crime to occur would prove nearly as impenetrable as the silence that followed. The investigation began within hours of the discovery, but it began without coordination. Villisca had no police department in the modern sense. Law enforcement was handled by the town marshal, Hank Horton, who had limited experience with serious crime. The county sheriff was notified, as were investigators from the Iowa Bureau of Criminal Investigation. Private detectives were later hired by parties connected to the victims. At various points, more than a dozen separate individuals or agencies claimed some level of authority over the case. There was no single lead investigator. There was no unified strategy. By Monday afternoon, the 10th of June, the crime scene had been thoroughly compromised. Townspeople entered the house freely. Neighbors walked through the rooms. Journalists took photographs. Souvenirs were removed. A piece of the blood-stained floor was later reported missing, taken by someone unknown. The axe was handled by multiple people before being properly secured. Bedding was moved. Doors were opened and closed repeatedly. By the time professional investigators arrived, the possibility of recovering meaningful physical evidence had largely been lost. No clear suspects emerged in the first 48 hours. Villisca was a small town, and the idea that one of its own residents could have committed such an act seemed inconceivable to many. Attention quickly turned to outsiders, transients, drifters, anyone who had been seen near the town in the days leading up to the murders. Several men were questioned, but none were detained for long. One early theory involved a man seen leaving Villisca on a dawn freight train on the morning of Monday, the 10th of June. A railway worker reported noticing a man boarding a boxcar shortly after sunrise. The man was described as disheveled and carrying a small bundle. He did not purchase a ticket. He did not speak to anyone. The railway worker thought nothing of it at the time, as transients often rode the rails without paying. It was only after news of the murder spread that the sighting gained significance. Attempts were made to locate the man, but he was never identified. Another early lead concerned a stranger who had been seen in Villisca on the day of the murders. Several townspeople reported seeing an unfamiliar man near the Moore house on Sunday afternoon. He was described as being in his 30s or 40s, of average height, wearing dark clothing. He was seen standing on the street, apparently watching the house. When approached by a neighbor, the man walked away without speaking. No one thought to ask his name or purpose at the time. After the murders, this sighting took on greater importance. Law enforcement attempted to trace the man, but no further information was found. He was never located. The first individual to be seriously investigated as a suspect was a traveling preacher named George Jacobs Kelly, though he was more commonly known by his middle name, Kelly. Reverend Kelly had been in Villisca on the night of the murders. He had attended the Children's Day program at the Presbyterian Church. He had been seen speaking briefly with members of the congregation, including the Moore family. After the program ended, Kelly left Villisca on a train departing shortly after midnight. He was traveling to his next engagement in a neighboring town. Kelly's departure in the middle of the night struck some investigators as suspicious. He had left Villisca within hours of the murders and his means of departure. A late-night train provided him with an opportunity to leave the scene quickly. Kelly was located and questioned within days of the crime. He stated that he had no connection to the Moore family beyond the brief pleasantries exchanged at the church. He had no reason to harm them. He had boarded the train because it was the scheduled departure that would allow him to reach his next appointment on time. His alibi was supported by witnesses who saw him on the train and at his destination the following morning. Despite this, Kelly remained under suspicion for years. His behavior was considered odd by some. He was known to be eccentric, prone to extended sermons and emotional outbursts. He had a history of erratic conduct, though no history of violence. Investigators continued to question him periodically, but no evidence ever emerged linking him directly to the crime. He was never charged. Another suspect was a local man named Frank Jones. Jones was a prominent businessman in Villisca. He owned a hardware store and had once employed Josiah Moore. The two men had been business partners, but their relationship had soured several years before the murders. Moore had left Jones's employment and taken a position with a competing firm, the John Deere Implement Company. Moore had also reportedly taken some of Jones's clients with him. The rivalry between the two men was well known in the town. Frank Jones had motive, at least in the eyes of some investigators, resentment, professional jealousy, a desire for revenge. But motive alone, is not evidence. Jones was in Villisca on the night of the murders, but so were hundreds of other people. He had no clear opportunity to commit the crime. He was a respected figure in the community, a man with a family and a business. The idea that he would murder an entire household, including 4 children and 2 young girls, seemed implausible. Nevertheless, suspicion lingered. Jones was never formally charged, but rumors persisted. Some believed he had hired someone to carry out the killings on his behalf. A man named William Mansfield, who had worked for Jones in the past, was later investigated as a possible accomplice. Mansfield was known to have a violent temper. He had been convicted of other crimes in subsequent years. In 1916, he was convicted of the murder of his wife, infant child, and 2 other people in Blue Island, Illinois, using an axe. The similarities to the Villisca murders were noted, and Mansfield was questioned extensively. He denied any involvement in the Villisca case. No evidence was found to connect him to the crime. He was never charged. The investigation suffered from a lack of physical evidence and an overabundance of theories. With no fingerprints, no witnesses, and no clear suspect, law enforcement relied heavily on circumstantial connections and public speculation. Dozens of individuals were questioned. Some were detained briefly, others were investigated for months or even years. But none of these investigations produced a prosecutable case. One significant error occurred in the initial hours after the discovery. The bodies were removed from the house and taken to a local undertaker before a thorough examination of the scene could be completed. Photographs were taken, but they were incomplete and poorly catalogued. The position of certain objects, including the axe, was not recorded with precision. Blood spatter patterns, which might have provided insight into the sequence of events, were not properly analyzed. The house was open to the public within days, further degrading whatever evidence remained. A coroner's inquest was convened on the 11th of June, 1 day after the murders. The inquest was meant to establish the cause of death and gather testimony from witnesses and investigators. It was a public proceeding, held in the local courthouse. Dozens of townspeople attended. Testimony was given by the individuals who discovered the bodies, by the physicians who examined them, and by neighbors who had seen the Moore family on the night of the murders. The inquest concluded that all 8 victims had been murdered by a person or persons unknown. No arrests followed. In the months after the murders, the case attracted national attention. Newspapers across the United States published accounts of the crime, the brutality of the killings, the innocence of the victims, and the apparent randomness of the act captured public imagination. Reporters descended on Villisca. Theories proliferated. Some suggested the killer was a madman, a homicidal drifter with no connection to the town. Others believed the crime was personal, motivated by revenge or hatred, directed specifically at Josiah Moore. Still others speculated that the murders were ritualistic, possibly connected to occult practices. None of these theories were substantiated. Private detectives were hired by members of the Moore and Stillinger families. These detectives operated independently of local law enforcement and, at times, in conflict with official investigators. Information was not always shared, leads were pursued in isolation, coordination was minimal. The result was a fragmented investigation in which different parties pursued different suspects based on different assumptions. The lack of a central authority allowed the case to drift without resolution. By the end of 1912, the investigation had stalled. No new leads had emerged, no suspects had been charged. The case remained open, but active efforts had diminished. The town of Villisca, traumatized by the crime, attempted to move forward. The house on East 2nd Street stood empty. No one wanted to live there. The memory of what had occurred inside those walls was too immediate, too disturbing. In 1917, 5 years after the murders, Reverend George Kelly was arrested and charged with the crime. The arrest was based largely on his presence in Villisca on the night of the murders, and on statements he had allegedly made in the years since, which some interpreted as confessions or admissions of guilt. Kelly maintained his innocence. He was tried twice. The first trial, held in 1917, ended in a hung jury. The second trial, held in 1917, resulted in an acquittal. Kelly was released. He was never charged again. The failure to convict Kelly marked the end of serious prosecutorial efforts in the case. Other suspects continued to be investigated sporadically over the following years, but no charges were ever filed. The case remained officially unsolved. The weapon was known, the victims were known, the approximate time of the crime was known, but the identity of the killer remained unknown, and the reason for the murders remained unexplained. The investigation had been undermined by poor crime scene management, lack of forensic expertise, conflicting jurisdictions, and an over-reliance on circumstantial evidence. The silence that surrounded the crime, the absence of clear motive, and the failure to secure physical evidence all contributed to the ultimate failure of the investigation. Villisca had suffered a tragedy, but it would never receive an answer. In the years following the murders, several individuals were investigated as potential suspects. Some had tangible connections to Villisca or to the Moore family. Others were linked to the case only by circumstantial patterns or geographical proximity to similar crimes. None were ever proven guilty in a court of law. Reverend George Kelly remained the most prominent suspect for decades. His presence in Villisca on the night of the murders, combined with his departure on a late-night train, created suspicion that was difficult to dispel. Kelly was an itinerant preacher who traveled throughout Iowa and neighboring states, delivering sermons at small churches and community gatherings. He was known to be highly religious, emotional in his preaching style, and somewhat unstable in his personal conduct. He had no permanent home and no steady employment beyond his irregular preaching engagements. After the murders, Kelly's behavior became increasingly erratic. He made statements to various individuals that some interpreted as confessions. In one instance, he reportedly told an acquaintance that he had been present in Villisca on the night of the murders and had experienced visions or dreams involving blood and violence. In another account, he allegedly stated that he had prayed for forgiveness for sins he could not name. These statements were vague and open to interpretation. Kelly himself later denied that he had confessed to anything, claiming his words had been misunderstood or taken out of context. Kelly's first trial began in September 1917 in Villisca. The prosecution argued that Kelly had attended the Children's Day program at the church, observed the Moore family and the Stillinger girls, and followed them home. According to this theory, Kelly entered the house sometime after midnight, retrieved the axe from the coal shed, and carried out the murders. Afterward, he walked to the railway station and boarded a departing train, leaving Villisca before the bodies were discovered. The defense argued that Kelly had no motive to kill the Moore family or the Stillinger girls. He had never met them before that evening. He had no personal grievance. He had no history of violence. The prosecution's case relied heavily on Kelly's own ambiguous statements and the timing of his departure from Villisca. There was no physical evidence linking him to the crime. No blood-stained clothing, no witnesses who had seen him near the Moore house after the church program ended. No forensic connection of any kind. The trial lasted several weeks. Testimony was given by townspeople who had seen Kelly at the church, by railway workers who recalled him boarding the train, and by individuals who claimed Kelly had made incriminating remarks in the years since the murders. The jury deliberated but could not reach a unanimous verdict. The trial ended in a hung jury. Kelly was not acquitted, but neither was he convicted. A second trial was held in November 1917 in a different jurisdiction to avoid the influence of local sentiment. The evidence presented was largely the same. The prosecution argued circumstance and opportunity. The defense argued the absence of proof. This time, the jury returned a verdict of not guilty. Kelly was released. He left Iowa and lived the remainder of his life in relative obscurity, maintaining until his death in 1933 that he had played no part in the Villisca murders. Frank Jones, the Villisca businessman and former employer of Josiah Moore, remained under suspicion despite never being formally charged. The animosity between Jones and Moore was well documented. Moore had left Jones's employment under contentious circumstances, taking clients and business contacts with him. Some believed that Jones harbored resentment deep enough to motivate murder, either carried out by his own hand or arranged through a hired agent. The theory that Jones had hired someone to commit the murders gained traction when attention turned to William Mansfield. Mansfield had worked for Jones in the past and was known to have a violent disposition. In 1914, Mansfield was convicted of assaulting a man in Illinois. In 1916, he was convicted of murdering his wife, his infant daughter, and 2 other individuals in Blue Island, Illinois. The weapon used in those murders was an axe. The victims were killed in their beds. The similarities to the Villisca case were striking. Mansfield was investigated extensively in connection with the Villisca murders. He had been in the general vicinity of Iowa in the weeks before the crime, though his exact whereabouts on the night of the 9th of June could not be conclusively determined. When questioned, Mansfield denied any involvement. He claimed he had never been to Villisca and had no knowledge of the Moore family. Investigators searched for evidence linking him to the town or to Frank Jones. None was found. Mansfield was never charged in connection with the Villisca murders. The theory that Jones had orchestrated the crime remained speculative. There was no direct evidence of communication between Jones and Mansfield regarding the murders, no financial records suggesting payment, no testimony from witnesses placing Mansfield in Villisca. The theory relied on inference and coincidence, was never disproven, but it was never substantiated. Another suspect who emerged in later years was a man named Henry Lee Moore, though he bore no relation to the Villisca Moore family. Henry Moore was a drifter and convicted murderer who had carried out a series of axe murders in the Midwest between 1911 and 1912. In December 1911, Henry Moore killed his mother and grandmother in Columbia, Missouri, using an axe. In September 1912, 3 months after the Villisca murders, he killed a woman and her 3 children in Ellsworth, Kansas, also with an axe. He was arrested shortly after the Kansas murders and was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. During his incarceration, Henry Moore was questioned about the Villisca murders. He denied involvement. Investigators examined the dates and locations of his known crimes to determine whether he could have been in Villisca on the night of the 9th of June. The timeline was plausible but not definitive. There was no physical evidence placing him in Iowa. No witnesses identified him. No records confirmed his presence in the area. Henry Moore remained a person of interest, but was never charged. The similarities between the Villisca murders and other axe killings in the Midwest during the same period led some investigators to theorize that a single perpetrator was responsible for multiple crimes. Between 1911 and 1912, at least a dozen axe murders occurred in small towns across Iowa, Kansas, Missouri, and Illinois. Most involved entire families killed in their beds. Most occurred in the early hours of the morning. In many cases, the killer appeared to have entered silently and left without being seen. This pattern suggested the possibility of a serial killer, someone who moved from town to town selecting victims at random or according to some internal logic that was never understood. The crimes shared enough similarities to be considered potentially related, but they also differed in significant details. Some involved robbery, others did not. Some showed signs of sexual assault. The Villisca murders did not. The theory of a single killer was compelling, but remained unproven. Law enforcement agencies in multiple states shared information about the various axe murders, but coordination was limited. Forensic science was in its infancy. Fingerprinting was not widely used. Blood typing had not yet been developed. Communication between jurisdictions was slow and often incomplete. Without physical evidence or eyewitness testimony, linking the crimes conclusively was impossible. Public pressure to solve the Villisca case remained intense for years. The murders had shocked the nation. The victims were innocent. The violence was extreme. The absence of answers was unbearable for many, particularly for the surviving family members of the victims. Rewards were offered for information leading to an arrest. Anonymous tips were submitted. False confessions were made by individuals seeking attention or suffering from mental illness. Each lead was investigated. None produced a viable suspect. The case also became entangled in local politics. The failure to solve the murders reflected poorly on law enforcement officials and elected leaders. Blame was assigned in various directions. The town marshal was criticized for failing to secure the crime scene. The county sheriff was accused of incompetence. Private detectives were accused of pursuing personal agendas rather than the truth. Rivalries and resentments within the community complicated efforts to work collaboratively toward a resolution. By the early 1920s, active investigation into the Villisca murders had largely ceased. The case remained officially open, but no new suspects were being pursued. The files were stored away. Witnesses had moved on or passed away. Memories faded. The murders became part of local history, a tragic and unsolved chapter in the story of a small Iowa town. Decades later, historians and amateur investigators revisited the case, examining old records and newspaper accounts, searching for overlooked details. New theories were proposed. Some suggested the killer was a member of the community, someone familiar with the Moore family and the layout of the house. Others maintained that the killer was an outsider, a stranger who acted on impulse or compulsion. Still others believed the murders were the result of mistaken identity, that the intended target was someone else entirely. None of these theories could be confirmed. The passage of time had erased too much. Physical evidence was long gone. Witnesses were no longer alive to be re-interviewed. The house itself had changed hands multiple times and had been altered in small ways over the years. What remained was a collection of facts, contradictions, and silences. 8 people had been killed. The weapon was known, the approximate time was known, but the identity of the person who carried out the crime and the reason it occurred remained unresolved. The case had been investigated by local authorities, state officials, private detectives, and amateur researchers over the course of more than a century. Yet no one had ever been successfully convicted. No definitive answer had ever been found. The Villisca Axe murders stood as one of the most thoroughly examined and persistently unsolved crimes in American history. The house on East 2nd Street stood empty for more than 2 years after the murders. No one in Villisca wanted to live there. The building had become associated with violence and death. Neighbors avoided walking past it. Children were told to stay away. The house was not immediately sold. Legal complications regarding the estate of Josiah Moore delayed any transfer of ownership. During this time, the house remained locked and unoccupied, slowly deteriorating from neglect. In 1914, the property was sold at auction. The buyer was a man named Darwin Lynn, who purchased the house with the intention of renting it to tenants. Lynn made minor repairs to the structure and advertised it for lease. Finding tenants proved difficult. Most people in the area refused to consider living in a place where such a crime had occurred. Those who did express interest often changed their minds after learning the history of the property. Eventually, tenants were found, though they rarely stayed long. Over the following decades, the house changed hands multiple times. Some occupants reported feeling uncomfortable in the house, though the specific nature of their discomfort varied. Some mentioned an oppressive atmosphere. Others simply found it difficult to sleep. A few tenants left after only a matter of weeks, citing unspecified unease. Whether these feelings were connected to the knowledge of what had occurred there, or to some other factor, cannot be determined. By the 1940s, the house had fallen into disrepair. Paint peeled from the exterior, the roof leaked, the wooden floors warped. Ownership changed hands again and again. Some owners attempted to restore the property, others allowed it to decay. The house never regained the ordinariness it had possessed before the night of the 9th of June 1912. It remained marked, both physically and in the collective memory of the town. In 1994, more than 80 years after the murders, the house was purchased by Darwin and Martha Lynn, descendants of the original post-murder buyer. They undertook a significant restoration, returning the house as closely as possible to its appearance in 1912. Original wallpaper patterns were reproduced. Period-appropriate furniture was acquired. The layout of the rooms was preserved. The goal was not to erase the history of the house, but to present it accurately as a historical site. The house was open to the public as a museum. Visitors could tour the rooms where the murders had occurred. Guides provided historical context, explaining the events of that night and the subsequent investigation. The house became a destination for those interested in true crime, American history, and unsolved mysteries. Thousands of people visited each year. Some came out of morbid curiosity. Others came with a genuine interest in understanding what had happened and why it remained unresolved. The museum also began offering overnight stays. Visitors could book the house for the evening and spend the night inside, sleeping in the same rooms where the Moore family and the Stillinger sisters had been killed. This offering attracted a particular type of visitor, those drawn to the possibility of experiencing something beyond historical record. Some guests reported unusual occurrences during their stays, footsteps when no one was walking, doors closing without cause, a sense of being watched. Others reported nothing unusual at all and left the following morning, having experienced only an uncomfortable night in an old house. These reports contributed to a secondary narrative surrounding the house, one that diverged from the historical account of the crime itself. The house became known not only as the site of an unsolved murder, but as a location associated with paranormal activity. Television programs were filmed there. Paranormal investigators conducted studies. Equipment was set up to record sounds, temperatures, and electromagnetic fluctuations. Some claimed to have captured evidence of supernatural presence. Others dismissed these findings as the result of suggestibility, environmental factors, or equipment malfunction. The historical record, however, remains concerned only with what can be verified. 8 people were murdered in the house on the night of the 9th of June, 1912. The crime was never solved. The house still stands. These are the facts. The rest is interpretation, speculation, or belief. Villisca itself has changed in the centuries since the murders. The population has declined. Many of the buildings that stood in 1912 are gone. The railway station closed decades ago. The Presbyterian church where the Moore family attended the Children's Day program still exists, though the congregation has dwindled. The house on East 2nd Street is now one of the most well-known structures in the town, visited by more people in a single year than live in Villisca itself. The case has been examined repeatedly by historians, criminologists, and writers. Books have been published analyzing the evidence and proposing theories. Documentaries have been produced. Podcasts have dedicated episodes to the murders. Each new examination of the case brings renewed attention. But none have brought resolution. The identity of the killer remains unknown. The motive remains unexplained. Some researchers have argued that the case could still, in theory, be solved. Advances in forensic science have made it possible to extract information from evidence that would have been unusable in 1912. DNA analysis, for instance, can identify individuals from trace amounts of biological material. If any physical evidence from the crime scene still existed and had been properly preserved, it might yield new insights. But no such evidence is known to exist. The axe was handled by too many people. The bedding and clothing from the crime scene were not stored under controlled conditions. The house itself was contaminated within hours of the discovery. The possibility of recovering usable forensic evidence more than a century later is effectively zero. What remains, then, is the story itself. The account of what happened on that night, reconstructed from the testimony of those who discovered the bodies, the observations of investigators, the records of the trials, and the reports published in newspapers at the time. The story is incomplete. It lacks a conclusion, but it is accurate to the extent that the historical record allows. The house stands as a physical reminder of an event that defies comfortable resolution. It is a place where the ordinary intersected with the incomprehensible. A family went to sleep in their home and did not wake. 2 young girls accepted an invitation to stay the night and were killed for reasons that remain unknown. The person responsible walked away and was never identified. The silence that surrounded the crime on the night it occurred has persisted for more than 100 years. Villisca has lived with this silence. The town has not forgotten what happened, but it has moved forward. The house, however, remains fixed in time. It is a monument to unanswered questions, to the limits of investigation. to the possibility that some events, no matter how thoroughly examined, will never be fully understood. Visitors to the house today can walk through the same rooms where the murders occurred. They can stand in the doorway of the guest room where the Stillinger sisters were found. They can climb the narrow staircase to the bedrooms where the Moore family slept. They can see the kitchen where the killer washed his hands. The house is quiet now. It has been quiet for a very long time. The story of the Villisca Axe murders is not a story with an ending. It is a series of facts that lead to a point and then stop. 8 people were killed. The weapon was found. The investigation failed. No one was convicted. The house still stands. These are the things that can be known. Everything else is conjecture, speculation, or silence. And in that silence, the question remains. Not who committed the crime, for that may never be known. But how such a thing could occur at all, how 8 lives could be ended in a matter of minutes, in a quiet town, without anyone hearing or seeing anything, how a person could walk into a house, commit such an act, and walk away without leaving a trace that could be followed to a conclusion. The answer, if there is one, has not been found. The house on East 2nd Street stands as evidence of that failure. It is a place where history stopped making sense, where the ordinary order of things broke down and was never restored, and it remains that way still more than a century later, waiting in the silence for a resolution that has not come.